Hi everyone, I know it's only just 11 o'clock, but we are going to start on time. Two of our speakers are here and we're waiting for our third. Hopefully they will turn up. So we have Professor Mustafa Ozbilgin with us today and Dr. Ruby Zelzer and Emilie Koum Besson, who is coming from somewhere else in the world. So it's not based in the UK today. So we'll just hopefully rearrange as we go and see what happens. So this is the first seminar on peer review bias. We do have another one coming up, which we'll talk about later. If you could go to the next slide, please, Vanilla. Thank you. This is about our timings today. So I'm going to do a short introduction, which just gives you some background as to why we're having this seminar today, which is about our peer review report. And then hopefully Ruby will talk and do a short Q&A on her conversation because she has to go, and then we will have Emilie and Mustafa talking on different topics, and then we'll have a general Q&A at the end. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just before we start, there is a code of conduct that EDICa has, which is just about general kind of respect for each other, particularly the speakers who are giving their time for free, which I very much appreciate, particularly as this topic is about racial bias in the peer review process. So if we could all talk to each other and chat with respect and appropriate language, that would be great. Unfortunately, if someone does decide to say something inappropriate, we will just expel them. That is our standard code of conduct. So thank you very much for that. Next slide, please, Vanessa. This is fun. I feel like a chef on television. So the reason why we're doing this report with this conversation about peer review bias is because we were commissioned to write a report about the peer review process, focusing on the funders and the sort of various funding stages. That is actually on our website. So if anyone wants to have a look and download that, they can have a read. I know that our speakers have had the opportunity to look at that. So we looked at all of the current literature over the last 10 years that's been peer reviewed. Focusing on which kind of disciplines it came out of, how many citations it had, how popular it was, what the topics were, as well as looking at the funders' documentation, which could be an EDI plan or could be some of their impact statements specifically to do with how they address bias. Next slide, please, for now. Thank you. So just very briefly, because we're going to talk about this whole topic rather than us waffling on about our report, which you can read at your leisure. So there are various kind of stages to the funding process, starting at the wording of the funding call, the application process, which you may need to do and sort of submit to your own institute before then being invited to actually submit that to the funder, the review stage and preparation review stage, and then the funding decision. So those are the 5 research sort of stages that we focused on, which is in our report, and reflects that in the kind of structure of the report. And we found that there are diverse kind of biases throughout these stages, you know, that affect marginalized groups, particularly looking at sort of gender bias, institutional privilege, and racial bias and inequity for ethnic minorities. We all know, I would say, if we're working in research and innovation, about gender bias and how prevalent that is. But what really sort of took me aback as an early career scholar is looking at how prevalent racial bias is in the funding process and how there is a kind of expectation on women and Black women in particular to submit more than other scholars, whether it's research articles or other outputs. So there is an expectation that they will be doing better and more and have more evidence of their career than others, which obviously then affects the kind of review stage and funding outcome decisions. So that's just a little bit of about our report. So Ruby, who has her own slides, is going to talk first. And so there's just a little bit of information about Ruby. So Dr. Ruby Zelzer is an independent scholar who has a PhD in material science. She focuses on metadata analysis for the purpose of eradicating systemic and institutional racism and has a good working relationship with a number of funders in the UK. So Ruby, whenever you're ready, if you'd like to talk, and if you have your slides, that's brilliant and want to share them. If not, I think Panella might.
Okay. Great. I'm just going to start my show. Okay, so hopefully we can all see that. And my title today is Racism and Peer Review. And I want to start, as I mean to continue, I want to name what we're actually doing. That's really my intention today. I want to start by saying I'm talking about racism and peer review. I want to add a caveat to that to say that I'm very aware of Black and marginalized.
Ruby, sorry, your sound is becoming very garbled, and it wasn't earlier. So do you want to just try and mute yourself and come back in, or just mute and unmute? Try again.
How's this? Is it still garbled?
It's still pretty garbled.
Let me just try and close everything
that's better.
that is on my background.
That's improved it.
Okay.
Yes,
is this
perfect.
okay? Okay, so I'll just go back to the beginning. I was talking about racism and peer review. That's really where I want to begin. I want that to be the sort of intention for today. I want to name it as racism in peer review. And what I have put down here is a picture of how we start out with about 8.5%, 9% of Black people being at the undergraduate level, and that whittles down to just one Black professor out of 100. And what I want to add is a caveat to that, to say that I am aware of Black and marginalized academics who have used the word racism, named institutional racism, named systemic racism, or just racism, and actually been ostracized by their universities or their organizations. So it is something that I want to say that I'm very aware of the way things go, and I have the privilege of being outside of academia. I can
Ruby. Sorry, it's really a bit tricky. Can you try and be a bit closer to the mic, or if you have one, maybe that a headset? Let's try.
I do not have a headset with me today, but I'm wondering is this any better if I move a little bit closer?
No, it's not.
Okay, let me just try and see if I can close all the background processes in my computer and see how it goes. Just I'm gonna try again. No. How's this?
It's still coming across as garbled. Can you try and not share your screen and see if that improves the quality? And maybe it's just that we have to do the sharing from our side.
And this?
Keep talking.
I am talking. Is this clearer?
That is an improvement.
We have a copy of your slides, Ruby. So, Fenella, are you okay to share those?
Yes, I will locate them and begin sharing. If you want to just kind of start over from the beginning and so that people can hear it better. Thanks.
No worries. So I will say that my talk today is about racism and peer review. I've put a caveat on that to talk about Black and marginalized academics who I'm aware who have been ostracized effectively from their organizations by talking about racism and peer review. However, I have a level of privilege for the fact that I am outside of academia, that I can actually name what it is. It is racism in peer review that I am referencing today. I want to add to that about organizational, I want to talk about like UKRI because that's the big funder. And I want to talk about the fact that in 2020, it was the case where it was acknowledged about racism. It was acknowledged about systemic and institutional racism and how that has impacted Black and other marginalized academics. But going forward in 2023, there's an EDI strategy that's released, which does not name race or racism at all. So that's sort of the environment that we are navigating in at the moment. And it's something that I feel like is really important for us to address. In my actual slides, I begin with a definition of what racism is, and it is about race as a social construct, to understand that. And it is about hierarchies, and it is about the fact that one group dominates resources compared to another group. So, oh, look, my slides are here. So if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so that is about the definition of what race is. So race is a social construct where characteristics such as skin color are used to create a hierarchy in order for one group to dominate resources or justify inferior treatment of other groups of people. And if we can move on to the next slide. And what I have done here is I want to follow the money. I think it's the fact that it's very hard for us to know what goes on in peer review on the panels when they actually are conducting funding panels. It's very hard for us to actually know it because these processes are not very transparent at all. But what we do see is the outcome of what happens afterwards. So this should actually be ethnicity of awardees as opposed to applicants. If you can go to the next slide. So here, what I have shown is the data that is currently available. This came out back in 2020. This was after a Freedom of Information request by Dr. Adi Adeline. And what it does show was the number of UKRI research awards by ethnicity between 2015 and 2020. And it's for studentships, for fellowships, and for PIs, as postdoctoral fellowships. Now, what you're trying to trace here is the Black people are in red, and it's invisible because it is invisible. It is there. If you strain your eyes really a lot to try and see it, you will be able to see it. It's somehow there a bit in the studentship, somehow a little bit there in the PI section for some of the councils. But it's really dominated by mostly white people, and then all others also have some form of marginalization, to be fair, as you go from studentships onto the PI section. And what happens is at every stage, Black people are less likely to successfully be awarded UKRI funding. And between 2015 and 2020, there was 0 recorded Black fellows. And I say that there are 0 recorded Black fellows to say that some places in the data, they have just a blank space, and then they want when you ask why is there a blank space as opposed to the number 0, there isn't a very clear answer given as to why that is the case. So all I would say is there were none recorded in the postdoctoral fellowship. That does not mean there were no Black postdoctoral researchers, but it just means they were not awarded the fellowships that would actually mark you out to be the candidate who's perhaps going to become the lecturer. So it is something where there's a certain advantage which is taken away from you towards as you're proceeding in your career. And can I go to the next slide? And it's not just about how many people get funding. It's also about how much funding do you actually receive in the end. And this is just wording from UKRI directly. And it says, due to the small number of awardees, award amounts are compared between the white ethnic groups and other ethnic minorities. So they have basically clustered everybody into Black. So if you're Black African, Black Caribbean, you're clustered into one place. If you are Asian, whether you're whether you're Pakistani or Chinese, you're clustered into one place. But we are aware that these groups, even within these groups, there are differences in treatment, but this is not possible to actually get out from the data that is given to us. And they do put another caveat to say that the disaggregating the award amounts is difficult because the group sizes are small, meaning the people who they give money to are small, and the values are suppressed, basically meaning that when they do give the money to you, if they actually round it off, it might come to 0. So they don't want to say it's 0 when it might be just 1. So on to the next slide. And so this is a bit of a data heavy one. So I'm just going to just draw your eye to the one on the left. I'm not good with my left and right, but it's the one on the left saying median award amount. So on that section, I want you to pay attention to sort of the colors that you see here. This is the color scheme that UKRI has used. And the white group is there at the very far right part with 2,175 successful applicants at the PI level. And the award amount for that is around 400,000. This amount is about the same for the mixed group and for the Asian group, although the numbers, if you look at the number of people who are actually awarded, are much less. So we have 2,175 for the white group, but for the other and for the Asian group, we actually have closer to 205 and 5. So these are very small numbers compared to 2,175. And right down there at the bottom, we have in green, the Black awardees who were given significantly less. So we were up at 400,000. We're going right down close to 150,000, and only 20 people were successful. And on the other side of the graph is about the award rate by value. And what that means is that how many people, how much was applied for, what percentage of that did they actually give out to these groups. And you can see again, it's the same disparity. So we have the white group in the same 2,175 getting about 30% of the award value, while for the Black researchers, only 20 of them, and it's well below 10%. So this situation that we're at tells you that somehow in funding peer review, as it's going through, as things are being assessed, something is happening where Black researchers are not just being awarded at a lower rate, they're also being given less money, and significantly less money compared to other groups. This is also true in some cases for other groups like the mixed group. However, the Asian group does perform a little bit better in terms of how much money they get. It's not so true in terms of how many people are funded, but in terms of how much money they get, it is comparable to what the white group gets. So that's a very interesting thing to actually think about. So can we go on to the next slide? And this was a very lovely unlabeled diagram, which for me as a scientist is quite something that we have been taught not to ever do, which is why I do it now. And it's to ask to, I was wondering if there's a possibility of interaction, because what I do want to actually ask, if it's possible, if anyone can guess what this is. I will give you a hint to say that this is the picture of UK professorship as it is in the United Kingdom. It's from 21, 22. Does anybody want to have a chance and a go? I don't know if it's possible. I'm not controlling the screen, so I don't know if anybody has a hand up who wants to try and hazard a guess. We've got a Q&A section, so people can submit a response in there if they want to have a guess, and I'll read them to you. Oh yeah, that would be great. So I would say that what I want you to know is that the big circle in blue are basically white professors. And the smaller circle in blue is literally male and female. So every single time you can see there's always a gender difference in every circle. And it's always the larger one being male, the smaller one being female. I want to say again, the Black women is invisible because it is invisible. It is there. There is a tiny little red dot somewhere on that picture. And one is a male dot and the other one is a female dot, and you can almost just not see it. It's yep, there you go. It's literally nearly imperceptible. So it is something to say to you that, and however that makes you feel, understand how marginalized as a Black person you are in academia when everybody else is so, in many senses, I think there's actually overrepresentation in terms of when you think about how undergraduate life starts and then who gets to stay in. This is the process of peer review. This is what it's generating. So if we can move on to the next slide. And this is about, again, still following the money, and it's asking which institutions are actually funded. And have put down a bunch of terms that, depending on your age, depending on your knowledge of elitism in United Kingdom, you may know some of these terms. So you've got post-92, you've got Oxbridge, you've got non-Russell, you've got Russell Group, you've got Red Brick, you've got Golden Triangle. And really, I want to pick up two of them today, which is about Russell Group and Golden Triangle. So if we can go to the next slide. And what I want to show you here is that 73% of UKRI awards to UK universities in 22-23 went to Russell Group universities. So Russell Group universities are 24 of them in United Kingdom. The data set, I want to say, is not very clean from UKRI, but you would say that they are maybe 150 applications that went through from 150 different universities. But basically 24 out of those 150 universities get 73% of the funding. So all other universities have just got a tiny bit of the pot to actually get. Majority of the funding is going to Russell Group universities. And it's a question to say, why? Is this actually a fair system that produces this level of, why is one group valued more than the others? So if you go to the next slide. And now this is about the Golden Triangle. The Golden Triangle, if you don't know, are the London-based universities and Oxford and Cambridge. So it's Oxford and Cambridge, University College of London, Imperial College, and King's College. So these are the 5 universities who take up, again, 1/4 of the money, nearly 1/4, is 23%, compared to all other UK universities. Okay, so I want to be clear with this. I want to say that some of these are preliminary figures because of the duplications in that data set, but I think it is pretty close to clean. So that's why I have actually used the data. I am still in conversation with UKRI to ask about these data set and actually clean it up a little bit better. But it basically tells you that there are 5 universities that are taking 1/4 of all the money that is being given to UK universities. There's money which does go outside of to other institutions, but I was focusing in on what happens within UK and within applications from UK universities. So if we can move on to the next slide. Okay, so really what I want to say is that peer review produces inequality. That is actually what it does. So whatever metrics they use to assess who is going to be funded, that peer review process, whether it is from publishing, whether it is from sitting down doing the panel review, what happens is that progressively over time, Black academics are squeezed out on their pathway towards becoming professors. And when Black academics are successful, they receive significantly less funding compared to other groups. And this is, the funding is not equally distributed in UK. It is 5 institutions are basically dominating most of the successful funding. So it's a question about what is happening that we are actually giving in our knowledge gap. There's basically a knowledge gap being created here because we're only basically valuing 5 universities in the whole of United Kingdom. We're basically saying that these are the ones who are somehow deserving of more money compared to other universities. And essentially what the picture that we have, which is the diagram which you have below, is about the ethnicity spread at full professorship compared to at undergraduate intake. So only groups that are increasing there are, so basically they're traveling more to the right, is the white group that you can see here, and as well the not known group, which is a curious case which I'm actually investigating about how much not known in the statistics actually seems to follow what is happening in the white group. So it is very interesting that that not known group actually, in some senses, because the patterns do follow everything that happens in the white group, could actually be linked together. But basically, those are the only 2 groups which are somehow increasing in proportionality as you go towards full professorship. Every other group, white, sorry, it's Black, Asian, mixed, other, all the other groups are decreasing. So we started undergraduate level saying this is who we're actually admitting into university. As we go over time, we're actually taking out, especially so the non-white groups. So if we could go to the next slide. And so it's a question about this meritocracy. And I've sort of picked out definitions here, which come from dictionaries and whichever one you want to pick. So I'll just read the one that I can see here right now, which is Britannica. And I'll say it's a political or social or economic system in which individuals are assigned to positions of power, influence, or reward solely on the basis of their abilities and achievements and not on the basis of their social, cultural, or economic background or irrelevant personal characteristics. And so that's the dream world of meritocracy. I do not believe that this is actually what is happening. What we're having right now is a certain group of universities which are assigned to money. We have a certain number of individuals who tend to be white, who are actually assigned money. So it does not appear to be on the basis of their abilities, achievements, because in many senses, if you're not successful at funding very early on, then how will you get to show your abilities, achievements? So I want to move on to the next slide, please. I think it's really important to talk about the myth of meritocracy. And I have two Black women professors that I have quoted here. And I'm going to read the first one. It says, "We should not doubt that racism is a system sometimes evidenced by isolated acts of aggression or exclusion, but mostly upheld daily by seemingly benign acts that masquerade as colorblind devices of meritocracy or neutrality, founded on a long history of racial formations." So to me, that is what peer review is. It is something that masquerades as meritocracy or neutrality, but really for so many years has produced basically this outcome that we see today, that 1% has not changed. 1% of Black professors has been the case for such a long time. And so therefore that to me is upholding racial formations. The next quote is about inequality is so often misunderstood as an outgrowth of cultural deficiency. But contrary to popular belief, which pervades the right, left, and center of the political spectrum, we do not live under a meritocracy. Inequality is not the result of superior or inferior work ethics of the society's inhabitants. So it's to say to you that when we talk about meritocracy, we really need to be careful about what we're doing and what is in practice, what meritocracy has actually meant. Okay. Next slide, please. And I want to just finish off by acknowledging the knowledge makers. I want to talk about Leading Roots and Broken Pipeline. I want to say the work of Nicola Rollock in Staying Power, talking about how Black female professors are underrepresented. I want to acknowledge Adi Adeline, and I was actually part of that letter, but I'm putting this one here to say I want to acknowledge Dr. Adi Adeline and her work, and to actually say that we need to go beyond the sort of standards that we actually use today. We need to go beyond looking at just peer-reviewed journals. We need to look at knowledge in a more expansive way. And that's it. That's it for me. The next one is a thank you slide. And there you go. That's me.
Thank you so much, Ruby. That was really, really interesting. And yeah, I remember the open letter and the fallout with UKRI, which was not necessarily a bad thing because it highlighted the issue so widely, which was amazing. Now we've got a couple of questions in Q&A. Now, just to remind people, Ruby does actually have to go shortly. So we've got about sort of, initially we have about 5 minutes, but maybe we'll have a bit more, maybe with Ruby, but I know you have to go and catch a train. So I'll just start off by asking some of the questions. So this was in reference to one of the slides when it was looking at data, so earlier before you get the pretty color bar graph. Was it only Black researchers that were being monitored? What about other ethnicities? I think that's to do with UKRI data.
No, so my work is about Black researchers, so that's why I actually prioritize them in my work. I think it's important for us to actually understand what happens from the margins. I do know that Black researchers are the most marginalized. I have actually presented in the work, as you have seen, that there are definitely other groups which are present. However, my research is specifically about how Black researchers compare to other researchers.
Thank you, Ruby. Are you able to tell us what the proportion of men to women are who submitted applications or proposals, not just those who were awarded?
Yes, that data does exist. It's not a data set that I have in my head of swimming around, but yes, that data set. No, wait, let me say it's not meant to women. What exists is how many applicants were, total number of applicants. So it's not about saying, so they have not actually done a gender-based one. I'm actually thinking about it. The UKRI data is the data that you're probably looking for. So that's actually linked in one of my slides. I'm actually wondering, I think, because I do not do work on a gender basis for myself. I think that the reason for me not choosing, apart from saying like Black women, I feel like that's something that I actually do. But I do want to say there's sometimes a red herring with data, because white women, for example, have been increasing. They're the fastest growing group of professors. So it's something that we have to actually understand as we're navigating this, is to understand that sometimes when we talk about men versus women, we actually really need to break down each individual group and what's happening in each individual group. I've just actually put in the UKRI data. There is actually some gender work and some disability work. I'm not sure of the quality of it, but you can actually go. One of the slides is referencing that. I can put it in the chat, can't I? The link to it.
Yeah, or you can, if you don't have access to that, which you might not, you can always send it to me and I can send it to all the participants. That's fine. Afterwards.
Yeah.
Shall I go ahead and ask you another question? Yeah, so one question here is, how do we start disrupting the injustice, Ruby? So this person says they're constantly stopped, monitored and over scrutinized, silenced or threatened with reporting me to my regulator.
Yeah. I want to say that I think that that's a very difficult question, because I keep being asked this question. I've said that like my privilege is because I'm outside of academia. So it's something where I know that very many, especially if you're Black or marginalized, you are going to be facing this. It is the case where I feel like it's really important that the people who benefit the most from these racial systems need to actually be the ones who are actually standing in the gap and saying this should not continue. So I actually feel like when people say they're allies, when people say that they want to be anti-racist, it does need to come from those who are benefiting the most to actually start doing something about it. So for me, I would say, like, when you're navigating as a Black or marginalized person, I would ask you to do it in a sense of community. Find the people who are actually most likely to support you, because that is the way that you will be able to survive academia. So I would really put much more effort on not being isolated when you're doing calling out racism. I would really emphasize that a lot. I would say as well to people who are in the majority basically, but it's not a real majority, but to say, like, if you're the one who's benefiting from these processes, can you think about how you can actually be an ally to actually say we want all knowledge from everybody?
That's great. Thank you so much, Ruby. Do you have time for one more question, or do you really desperately? I know you have to run for a train.
I'm leaving at 12 is when I'm leaving, so I actually have time.
You have time for another few questions. Okay, great.
Yeah.
What would you like to see UKRI do to address peer review bias specifically?
I would really like to see the end of peer review as is currently. That is really the dream situation for me, because I do think that what we have currently right now basically promotes what we've always had. And people want to make small incremental steps by saying, why don't we educate people about what is happening? But I would say, like, pretty much if you look around every university, people have done EDI training, people have done anti-racist training. So I sort of feel like those small interventions are not perhaps the way to go forward. The way to go forward would be to start a process where you are actually going to be inclusive. You're going to have to challenge the systems that you have right now. You're going to have to challenge, why is it that you are funding just the Golden Triangle? Why are you just funding the Russell Group University? So these thoughts need to be put into place. So what I would love to see is like a genuine step towards inclusive knowledge, where you're actually trying to get knowledge from different places, different sources, and reform the entire peer review system. That would be my genuine part. I do feel like what is going to happen is, if you have gone onto the UKRI website, they have something which is a peer review of peer review, and they have a number of interventions that they have put down, which they say are possible to actually do for if people are trying to change what they're doing in their peer review process. But I do think all of them are very small and unambitious. For an organization such as UKRI, I think it's time to actually be bold. And I would actually love to see that, like an actual overhaul of what peer review is.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. What a fantastic note to finish on, actually, Ruby, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I think Emilie is here, who is our next speaker. Are you still?
She is, but she's in a car heading towards a hotel. So what I was going to suggest is, if Mustafa is prepared, if he could go first.
Brilliant. Thank you. So just to, while you set up Mustafa, I'm just going to introduce you. So Professor Mustafa Ozbilgin is Professor of Organisational Behaviour. He does research in equality, diversity, and inclusion at Brunel University in London. And he's going to talk today about review bias in the publishing process, which obviously affects funding and vice versa.
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction, Kat, and wonderful talk from both of you, Kat and Ruby. So thank you so much for inviting me to EDICa. It's a pleasure. What I tried to do was to reflect on my 15 years of editorial experience and talk about how the publishing process and the editorial experience in journals is also riddled with full of bias. And what I tried personally to do in my 15 years of editorial experience, some of you might have experienced my editorship of Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Journal for over 6 years. And then I was editor of the British Journal of Management and then European Management Review, these 3 journals. During that time, of course, I was fully aware that the publishing process, review process is has certain biases. And what I also thought that about bias is that bias is the very much individualization of the experience, but as the previous speakers highlighted, actually the issue is systemic. Those biases are very much entrenched in access and resource inequalities. So I think focusing on bias can undermine sometimes, individualizes our efforts. And beyond all of those things are, of course, underrepresentation issues, which were clearly highlighted. And if I ask the question, why is this bad? Why is bias bad? Bias is bad because it warps science fundamentally. And why is it bad? For example, the Golden Triangle to get all the money. Because it warps science. There are good scientists in all universities, and we need to have an equal share of the funding, of course. And the previous talks, I can't catch up with them, but they were fantastic. When I was editing the journal Equality, Diversity and Inclusion, an international journal, I wrote a piece for the Academy of Management Learning and Education, criticizing how our system of academic research has become very competitive. The competition actually comes with tendencies to introduce or entrench the current forms of inequalities. Science needs more collaborative vision. Science needs more inclusive vision, and this was not the case. So after I wrote this piece, I applied to become the editor-in-chief of the British Journal of Management, and they were all sitting there with this paper criticizing their management of the journal. I said something like, it's not even fit for a village newsletter, because the journal was lacking in diversity, and it was managed by a group of really, you know, I don't want to be rude, but, you know, pale, stale, male, elite. So, when I had early discussions in this journal, they were like so trusting in anonymity, which was really rubbish. It was a liberal way to eliminate bias. I couldn't believe, like, grown adults thinking that anonymity will save anything, save the day in terms of eliminating bias. They were talking about anonymous peer review. We know who the authors are. Fields are so small, we are so siloed. And we know who does what kind of work. For example, work on ethnicity and ethnic bias would not get any positive reviews from majority of the scholars. And a triple anonymous review was the final, you know, red flag for me. You know, you wouldn't even see the names of the authors as an editor. I think this is all. We need to question the effectiveness of these proposals to eliminate bias. Then I looked at the field I was there as a lecturer, international human resource management, and most of the authors in there were white, British or North American, and it was not an international field at all. So I tried to move between my own research on equality and my editorial experience in this process. And instead, I started proposing cascaded responsibility. I said that we need to start from the very top. For example, as an editor, I removed my privilege to be to have this papal infallibility assumption. I created an ombudsman system for the journal. So the journal, if the authors criticized my management of the process, if they found any bias or any irregularity, they could go to an ombudsman editor. So we need to also create this structure in other journals, because the infallibility of the editor really entrenches biases. Also, we can start from the bottom. There's a bottom-up process of reviewer development workshops, and resources can be developed to equip reviewers. We assume that reviewing is an inborn trait, but eliminating biases in review is actually learned. It's learned traits, so we need to push for that. We need to have review colleges that teach reviewers how to review without bias, how to care for equality and inclusion. And my most recent idea on this is to have self-reflection prompts, because AI can be a force for good. AI can tell the reviewers, for example, that their language is exclusive. Their language has, for example, gender bias, disability bias, race bias. AI can be used to detect that. These self-reflection prompts, I really believe that we need to be more cognizant of AI. I worked with several people, Kate Sang, you know, and Chari Yalkin, looking at different aspects of inequalities in higher education. Not a good story. I'll tell you the truth. It's been paying my mortgage for over 30 years, this business of inequality, but nowhere worse than higher education. So continuing with cascaded responsibility, the game does not start with reviews, or game does not start with funding. The game is the value chain. There's a whole value chain from the inception of an idea to its research, how people make careers with this research, and then how it is published, how they turn these publications into career capital again, and then maybe secure more funding to do more meaningful research. So, but we need to also dissect this whole value chain into parts. For example, we can look at the reviewer pool. How do we create our reviewer pool? In the British Journal of Management, I suggest that associate editors to choose 3 reviewers, one for the team, where the location, one for the theoretical field, and one for the method. And the reviewers could be then assigned these specific focus, because we are existing in such silos that interdisciplinary work gets no viewing at all. And it brings in a lot of biases in terms of gender and ethnicity, because the more you are a heterodox person, an atypical person, an outsider within, the more likely that you will do interdisciplinary work. So it's connected, interdisciplinarity and atypicality. There's also this issue of conflict of interest management. I see in many journals, they create cliques, and the editor publishes the work of their best friends in the journal. And it creates white ghettos, and similarly powerful groups, publishing groups dominate. So we need to have this conflict of interest management done in a more proper way. We did some work with students, how they experience the hidden curriculum. And they report that hidden curriculum is not only the curriculum within the university, but their whole experience. It's the same with academia. We need to look at the whole experience. But coming back to cascaded responsibility, I sprinkled my own work within, so that shamelessly doing advertising during my talk. Explicit criteria scoring reviews is very helpful, because I think the reviewers can express their taste, that they are not convinced, they don't like this idea. If we let them just review as they please. So having more explicit criteria and forcing the reviewers to highlighting to reviewers what needs to be reviewed and how the review needs to take place, that it is a developmental process, very important. Open discussion and review moderation is absolutely essential, because I have seen many statements of racism, sexism, homophobia in review pieces. And we need to really tackle that by a discussion between the editor and the reviewers. This is absolutely essential. It's not a one-way process. It shouldn't be. We recently worked on this value chain of academic publishing. It's really interesting model. It's the top 4 publishers are the most lucrative businesses in the world internationally, and they benefit from our free labor. No other business is more exploitative than academic publishing. The ownership structure is really interesting, because out of our free labor, they get extreme profitability. So we need to question this model as well, if you want to really look at it carefully. I know that my time was short, so I only gave snippets, but just to conclude 3 points. We should move from this individualized bias elimination and identity politics towards strategies for institutional interventions. And this is not only in journals, but also in our academic lives. We need to look at the systemic change rather than head counting practices. We need to move from head counting practices to bringing people in and keeping them there. And it will mean institutional change. You can bring them there, but if it's a hostile environment, they will leave. So the commercialized education, research, and publishing model requires a revised look at ownership. Voluntarism. Our voluntarism is very naive, and it's unsustainable, I think. And the value chain in review and editing practices, we need to really be more critical of the inequalities that are embedded in these systems. And finally, at the short term, I think that we need to go back to our institutions and renegotiate to recognize editorial and review work within the university systems, because this is another difficulty. A lot of women and minority ethnic people do more reviews, and there's little recognition in our university systems because they consider it as part of the job that you have to do. But we are, in order to join the game, we lean in more than others. So others are parachuted in or helicoptered up, lifted up, and we have to do more to be included. So we need to get the universities to recognize our efforts as legitimate. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. That was a really, really interesting talk. I do have a lot of questions coming in, so thank you very much for that, everybody, for you. We can go straight to Q&A with Mustafa, but I'm not sure if Emilie is actually there.
Yes, I'm here.
You're here, brilliant.
I'm here. Thank you.
I know you're in Guinea, right? So you've got an interesting connection. So thank you very much for racing back to the hotel to do that.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk now, or shall I? Do you want it go in a minute and in about 5-10 minutes once Mustafa's done Q&A? What would you prefer?
Up to you. Like, I'm fine with both ways.
Okay.
I'm here now.
You're here now. Well, exactly. And if your connection is here, let's get you while you're here, if that's okay, Mustafa. So if you could, thank you very much. I appreciate that. So lovely to see you. Thank you so much for joining us today. So yeah, whenever I know you don't have slides, which is fine. So whenever you're ready, if you want to chat. So you do have about 15 minutes if you want to take up that time. Just as a very brief introduction, Emilie Koum Besson is a specialist in health finance at the Global Fund and is an advisory board member for EDI at the European Global Health Research Institute Network. We actually got to know Emilie from reading one of her amazing papers, which is part of the report. So please do go read that if you haven't already. Take it away, Emilie.
Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me well and that my connection is going to be stable. Sorry, because I might repeat things that have been discussed before, but so I'm just going to try to explain why I'm here today and why I've been invited. So as it was mentioned, it is about the notion of epistemic injustice in global health research funding practices. So the way I kind of found myself in that reflection was really unplanned. So through discussions within my former employer, which was the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, I found out that there was a project that was being commissioned by UK donor around why global North applicants are more likely to receive the funding than global North applicants, especially in the context of funding that were destined to research in humanitarian context. So they did what we do in research, meaning take the reviewers' feedback, look at them, conduct like a qualitative analysis, identify themes, and then reach conclusion. And so the person came back to me to present the result. And this was not the first time that this analysis was being conducted. And they felt like, yeah, it's always the same. The global North applicants are just stronger. And but when she started telling me about the result, that's when I realized how very often we talk about positionality and perspective, and we have all those discussions around positionality statement, but it was very clear that like those positionality statements are not fully understood, because a positionality statement and the positionality of someone in research is really linked to the way they understand an environment, the way they see it, what they know, what they don't know about the environment, and all things. So one example, which I always use because it was very personal, is when I joined LSHTM as a research fellow, I remember seeing the budget. And in the budget, my PI was listed at 20%, which scared me because I thought, okay, like he's the one who's supposed to lead on this, so how can he be 20% on the project? But it was because in high impact countries, the PI is working on multiple projects. So there's 20% on one, 20% on another, and all things. But so according to some reviewers, when they were receiving application from Global South researcher that were put themselves 100%, they thought it was a way to cheat the system and get more funding. And so it was so interesting because I remember the day I saw myself, my PI as 20% and thinking, what is going on? Because in many Global South countries, you do not have institutional funding for research. So most of the time when they apply, that money that they're expecting to receive is what's going to allow them to work on their research for 100%. And when they work on the application, very often they have their full-time job, they can be doctors or like have other activities. And so having funding to do research for 1 year is the opportunity for them to actually be able to work on the research for 1 year. But imagine doing that and having a reviewer thinking that like you are overestimating your cost. And we started just from that example, we started looking at other things, and we realized that like there were a lot of biases, conscious and unconscious, that were really rooted in that document. And that's where positionality is important, because if you don't know how things are being done in other contexts, you can only use your own context to conduct the analysis. And by applying your own context, you're actually just favoritizing your people, the people who live in that context, that are being bred and born and that only understand that context. So in the paper, I go through that explicitly, but I would just cite like few examples. The first one, the other one also that like was very telling was a comment that the finding or the research was not being generalizable. And this really linked to that notion and the fact that like I really apply that, I developed that framework in the context of like global coloniality. The notion of universalism is really rooted in coloniality. Why? Because people think of Africa, for example, as a whole. Like they're very like sometimes, oh, in Africa is like this, in Africa is like that. Africa is 52 countries, even more than that. There's an island, there's a small state, there is like Francophone, Anglophone, Lusophone, and all things. But there is that idea that it should be Africa. And also in the global north, and based on that notion, like inspired by that idea of coloniality, where we were looking at like the continent and like the region of the global south as a whole, there is that practice of like wanting to lump countries together. You would see a paper talking about Ethiopia, Cameroon, Ghana, and like, I don't know, Capo Verde in the same frame. And for a lot of us African, it doesn't make any sense. We're like, how can all those countries have a similarity? But this is what very often makes a paper more publishable. The more countries that you have, the more that you can push the idea of like generalizability and universalism, the more impact is given to your paper. And so very much in the global north, people often try and say, oh, we're going to do analysis of those 3 countries and try to generalize this and this and that. But if I'm someone in Cameroon, where I'm originally from, and doing a research on humanitarian crisis in northern Cameroon, my focus is the people in that crisis in northern Cameroon. There is no way that I'm going to draft a project thinking about, is my research going to also help like people in Somalia? I don't know Somalia. I don't even know the context. And so people in the country don't think like that. And one of the questions that I raised in the paper was, do you really think that UK researchers, when they do research on like HIV, TB, like anything in the UK, are doing that research thinking, I hope that my result is going to be able to be used in Brussels, in the United States, in Germany, and all things. But that consideration is imposed on African researchers and Global South researchers in general because of the colonial origin of like that type of research. And so those are things that are so ingrained and so natural to a lot of researchers in the global north that the reviewers were not even aware that they were discriminating systematically discriminating against researchers in those places. Because if your research is being given a lower grade because it's not generalizable, it means that like those funding that are supposed to support the country in addressing the issues in their context are never funded. And we have like other research which is conducted in the global north on like analysis that maybe does not meet the need of the context because they are not contextualized enough. There was also that consideration around methods. And so reviewers would sometimes comment and say, oh, this method is maybe not the best, or we don't know about this. And like they were using Western standard. And the reality is very often we think like RCT or even method or like medicines or tools which have been designed in the global north as the best. And so we don't give space for researchers in the global south to they kind of develop their own tools. Because if the tools is not known from the global north reviewer, they might not be comfortable in accepting it. And then it becomes in consideration of like, yeah, but what if it doesn't work? Because we know that this is the best and like this is this and this and that. But if we don't acknowledge the fact that like tools from the global south might not be useful in the global north and vice versa, and we keep like looking at it from some Euro like centrism, then we will discriminate again systematically against like global south partners because we look at it from like what we know, what is being developed in the UK. And I'm not from the UK when I say we is because of that dual culture between like France, where I partly grew up, and Cameroon, where I'm from, and my family and like my roots are. The fourth example is going to be also around diplomas and like access. The notion that sending a request for proposal to everyone on the same time is equitable is not true. Because when you do research in humanitarian, there was never any consideration of the fact that if I'm, I don't know, in Eastern Congo during like one of the crises or anything like that, first of all, my internet is extremely expensive. I'm leaving the country. Then there might be a crisis. I'm working at the same time. I'm not being paid to just like develop that research. I'm doing this on top of other activities. Whereas it's very different than from a person who is doing research in the UK and who is in their office and who's like part of the job is to look for money. So you write proposal, but you don't have issues with access to internet, access to phones and all things. So I was also arguing with them and saying, what if you would give an extension to those people? Because actually the context in which they're writing the proposal is very, very different. And then you have consideration around diplomas. We would say, oh, we need to have a PhD. But do you know that in certain countries, a PhD is longer? Even if you compare between the UK and the US, a PhD in the UK is 3 years. In the US, it's 5 years. In Botswana, it's 7 years. So you have a proposal from Botswana, someone telling you that they don't have a PhD yet, but you don't know that they've been working for 5 years on their PhD, and like the requirement for them are maybe even higher than the one in the UK. But just with one criteria, you're removing people. Another criteria that has been very fascinating to me all the time is that notion of having a global health degree. Global health degree only exists in the global north. If you are from Nigeria and you have been working or like in country or like experience, field experience, you're a doctor from Nigeria, mandatory to the law, when you graduate, you need to do 1 year in a rural area. But this is not something that people would even think about putting in their experience as like field experience. And so when you submit your resume, compared to an American who did Peace Corps, you don't have the experience. It doesn't make any sense. And so how can you evaluate someone's experience based, again, on standard and on an approach that is very much rooted in the global north? The global north, you want to have country experience, you need to go there. But like, if you are in the global south, you have a degree in public health, you have worked in like as community work because it's like mandatory in your curriculum, those experiences are not always like valued or put forward in those contexts. And to be fair, it is an issue of the reviewer, but also the applicant, because the applicant wouldn't even think about putting it. I've had a lot of conversation with students at LSHM in the past, and I said, why you never put your like vernacular language in your resume? You put English and French, but you don't put that you speak Bambara, Pearl, or any other language. Whereas like those are languages that are very important. But if you look at the resume of a Peace Corps person, they would always put it, always. But very often this is not valued. And so thinking about those reviewer bias and like that notion of global coloniality, the whole paper was to talk about the fact that you have that notion of like coloniality of being, which is the fact that those standards are not clear, they're not like really put in the document, but they are known and internalized to some of the applicants. And so very often they do not put certain information, or they put themselves in a position where they have kind of internalized an inferiority because their experience is never valued, their degrees are never valued, their tools are never valued, and they're being dismissed systematically because it's always put in comparison to the Western tools rather than like looked into the context of their environment. Then you have that notion of like coloniality of power, which is the fact that like those calls for proposal come from the UK. So at the end of the day, even with this type of analysis, like the research, the company can still decide that I actually want people with a PhD of 3 years. I actually want people who speak perfect English. I also want people who aim to do studies that are generalizable. And I want people who use only Western standard. They can do that because they have the money. They decide what are the criteria. And one of my recommendations to them was you need to be very clear in what you're looking for. And then you have that coloniality of knowledge, where you consider that like some form of knowledge, some approach to having knowledge are more valuable than others. And so when you also look at reviewers and you take only reviewers from the Global South, or you even say that like someone from the UK can do a review of like researchers from Syria or like from Myanmar, you're already like imposing a coloniality of knowledge, because you could have actually reviewers from those countries included in the pipeline because they know the context and they can look at it from a perspective that is completely different. And so, but those are the things that like we discuss, and that's how, when you look at like biases in global health research funding practices, it's not thinking about actively trying to prevent other people. It's about the fact that like when you think about positionality, you really need to think about the way you think about research and remind yourself that like the way you have been taught to do research and the way you've been looking at certain contexts is very different and can be completely opposite from the way the people from the country look at it. And that like if we're looking and we're moving towards like equality or even equity, we need to think, is it something that I would apply as a British person? Is it something that I would apply to another British person? Would I ask a British researcher to be generalizable? Would I ask him to only have a certain type of degree? Would I consider their personal experience and lived experience in the analysis? How would I look at this? And so if we cannot apply those type of similar standards and we still are unable to see that like the way we look at research in our context is very different from the way we apply and we impose research in other contexts, then those biases are going to continue and they're going to remain systematic. Over for me. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you so much, Emilie. I got some people messaging me saying that you're a powerhouse and really passionate. So really enjoying your talk. Thank you very much, as well as yours, Mustafa. So I've got quite a number of questions here. Someone made a comment, which I think is actually quite important. Martin Dominique, I hope I pronounced that correctly, said there are more languages spoken across Nigeria than across the whole of Europe. So that's very good to know. Thank you. And I thank you for that comment. So I've got a question here for you first, Emilie, if that's okay. And then I've got a couple more for Mustafa. So Emilie, how do we encourage recognition of collectivist research methods that collect data on lived experience? It seems that these are closer to the societal impact we seek, but are not essential in well-funded global North research programs.
Can you repeat the end? Like, what is not essential? Yeah.
So
how do we encourage it? Because yeah, I understand. I really think, like, for me, those calls for proposal, at first they're just administrative. So the thing that like we need to be able to put very clearly in those guidelines. And I think that's like sometimes the way I received the information was, like, you know, we make it like quite general because we want to allow everyone to do this and blah, blah. But I'm like, no, you need to be very precise. And even when you think about doing research in Africa versus like Asia versus this, there's so many different practices that are very important. Another example, for example, that I also thought was very interesting is in some countries, the PI is always the first author. Some people associated that with like being unfair. maybe it's unfair, but that's the rule in the country. And so it was very strange because there was that sense that like, oh, this person is like trying to take ownership of everything and like we need to protect the others. Yes, you can put guidelines, but you're not going to just change the entire culture of like an organization. And also another example, and like why I'm saying that how you can encourage it is also learning from other contexts. I remember speaking to someone who's coming from a Latin American country. I don't remember the name, so I'm not gonna try. What they were saying that as a researcher, they had the obligation to publish in lay journals. In the UK, everything is being evaluated with you publishing in an academic journal. But in that context, they were saying, no, 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 research is for the people. If your research doesn't access the people in your community, then it's completely useless. So first is that. But imagine an application when you just, again, submit papers. And if you don't have a publication in the Lancet and all things, when already the consideration of like the systematic exclusion of those voices is not taken into consideration. So already if you use that as a criteria, you would systematically have more like Western people, global North people in the list is important. So I think if you want to encourage people to really include activities that are more these like pushed towards like the country, you need to have reviewers from the country systematically. And I have to say with that analysis, even after, it was funny because they had a conversation internally and they realized that like they didn't know people in the countries where they were working. So they actually came to me for certain recommendations saying, oh, do you know the researchers from this university or like from this country? And I'm like, I've been a research organization for so long, working only in the global South countries, and you don't have contact with the national university in public health and everything of those countries. Those people could review those analyses. So we need to be able to have a system where the request of funding can come from the UK, but you could also have like research partnership with university in the country, and they are the one who know the priority. They can decide this actually would really help the country. This actually would be linked to the context. But there are certain things that needs to be removed. And I think it's about how we prioritize the activities and come from the research funders. If they really want to do the work for the country, they will. And to be fair, I think the question also was confusing to me at first because the reality is like I did not have any pushback on those comments. The moment that they realized it, they were like, oh my God, how did we miss that? And they started like implementing changes. And so I do think it's possible. I do think that those researchers want to still keep a certain level of like ownership and power over that. And so maybe selecting certain people and all things, but I do think that like in the end, in that specific case, there was a desire to improve their impact. Because at the end of the day, if you're a donor, you don't have any impact, like your donor is also not gonna give you more fundings. And in the context that we are right now, I think impact is important. So I hope I answered the question. I went a bit.
No, that was great. That was an expansive answer. Thank you, Emilie. Like you addressed a lot of things within that. And it was a broad question, so thank you. I think kind of your answer sort of feeds into this question, which is from Mustafa. It's about recruiting diverse researchers, reviewers, in fact, which speaks to that kind of what Emilie was saying about having the right people to look at funding or publishing. So on recruiting diverse researchers, how do you uncouple the need to recruit experienced field leaders from the fact that bias precludes researchers from ever being a field leader in the first place?
Yes, it's a very good question. Thank you for this thoughtful question. One of the issues that we experience when we are recruiting reviewers is the trust deficit that we have of atypical researchers that are not considered field leaders. So we need to first tackle our own biases in terms of who are field leaders. And we need to really broaden our pool. It doesn't happen on its own, because if we leave the current system, we have already seen that representation is very low in terms of atypical candidates from disadvantaged backgrounds are poorly represented in academia. So what I did as an editor is to broaden the pool by trusting. I trusted a wider range of people with the requisite qualifications and didn't believe in the halo of privilege and elite status. So I dismantled some of the notions of, field leaders. For example, in recruiting board members, I had a rule of active membership. So if you reviewed more than 2 papers for the journal, you could ask to be included in the board. And I asked the board members to step down if they haven't reviewed actively, despite them being really great names. We need to really think about who we are holding up. If we are truly meritocratic and caring about performance, then we have to really play the game in that line, and that can eliminate some of the bias. But also we need to open up to new methodologies. A lot of journals and publishing outlets say that they are open to all methodologies, but if you look at them, 95% of them are publishing, especially in business and management field, publish quantitative work with positivistic paradigms. So it's very particular approach. So we need to be really deliberate and honest. Most journals are not intellectually honest even. So we need to go, we need to question the leadership thinking and try to modify that and challenge that if it's possible.
That's great. Thank you very much. Really interesting answer. So I've got a question here about the availability of data. I'm sure there is data available, it's just whether or not the journals release it. Is there any data available on how double-blind or open peer review affects diversity in journals in the peer review process? Sorry, Emilie, I'll come back to you in a minute.
Yes, we always use double peer review in most of the journals that are ranked in our system. If you look at the business and management field, double peer review is standard, but trusting double peer review to generate neutral and unbiased outcomes is wrong. It's of course better than non-peer reviewed work because it has oversight and we are able to help the authors develop their paper through review. But it's not the method to solve the bias crisis that we are experiencing, because that's the only answer I used to get. Oh, we have double blind peer review. In terms of data, I can say that 100% are now double blind peer reviewed. But we often, in this process, what gets really forgotten is the power that the editor has in sending the papers to toxic reviewers. So if you get a paper from with a global south topic and send it to a positivist scholar, and you can imagine the epistemic injustice it will receive. There is a lot of power vested in editorship, and I think we need to also question that. But in terms of data, I can say that 100% are now double peer reviewed. So I don't know the previous period. Maybe journals would hold the data.
Thank you. Emilie, did you want to come in on one of the questions that were asked as well?
Yeah, I think it was this question and the one before, just like to clarify. I was reading it, so it was clearer. I don't think about pushing one method or encouraging one method over the other. I think the idea here was that we need to be able to allow researchers from multiple contexts to develop their own research tool. And we need to be open to the fact that like those tools are just different and take risk. I think we often talk about innovation in like funding and all things, but we don't think about innovation as like methods. And so if you don't think about innovation as like method and approach, then it becomes a bit, I don't know, empty of sense or anything. I don't think, yeah. So that was the thing that I wanted to say. And I think in general, also the idea of diverse recruitment has always been a very kind of sore topic because, for example, I'm originally from Cameroon, and I remember someone tried to reach out to me to do some work in Cameroon, and I said, no, I've not lived in Cameroon like that. I cannot speak of like the Cameroonian experience and like especially doing research in like Northern Cameroon, which is the Anglophone part where I don't know anything about this. And so I think there is balance sometimes between like diversity and tokenism that needs to be considered, but also the reality is diaspora members, sometimes we have that kind of double agent and double perspective. And it is possible that like some of us who have been fully trained in like a Western context are also pushing for this Western paradigm. And so it's kind of like understanding positionality is really that. Is not just about being from a different country or looking different or like all things. It's really about diversity of thoughts. And I can talk to researchers in Cameroon and I do not have their perspective. Like there's just because I don't see what they see, I don't live what they live, I don't have the differential access. There are more research that have access to online that they do. So they also do more research based on like their context. They have networks that I don't have, which are more like other national researchers in the region and all things. So I think we really need to think about even diversity of recruitment in a way that goes beyond just like how people look like. And that's why like those positionality statements, there's a lot of back and forth. And there is a paper that I really want to read about from a researcher at SOAS talking about like the coloniality of them. And I do think that people just need to better understand what it means. And writing a paper and saying like, I'm a white woman from America is not a positionality statement. It's just like, I don't know, some information about yourself, but there needs to be a thinking about how do I view those people? What has been influencing my approach? How do I move from there? Like what different is there? And we need to think about that more because especially like now we see that in the UK, diversity does not mean like having like open mind on like everything. And like, yeah, I'm gonna stop here. Let's leave the politics out.
Well, you can bring the politics in. I've got no problem with that. I'm sure no one else does because it is interlaced with research and funding and publishing, absolutely. And I absolutely think your point about positionality statements is incredibly relevant and really powerful one. So thank you for that. I've got one more question before we wrap up. It's a two-parter. It's for you, Mustafa. I've just going to refer to my notes because I had to break it down a little bit. So this was specifically in the context of you advocating for allocating 3 reviewers, one for theme, theory, and method. So the first part of the question is, how do we get currently underrepresented groups into the review process while still keeping the role of the senior experienced reviewers? For example, could we do a ratio of 1 in 3 being a less experienced reviewer?
Okay. I think this is really another great question. Again, it's about making sure that you trust people who are different to the core of academy, who are newcomers. That may include gender differences, ethnic differences, people with neurodivergent characteristics, different sexual orientation, gender identity groups coming on board. I think their choices of method and their choices of team place would be different. So we need to broaden our pool by this recognition, because if we keep on using all the reviewers, they will not know how to treat those new geographies, new approaches. And in terms of, this is the second part is very difficult for me. I mean, if you know the answer to that, please let me know, because I think we are having a fatigue in review. I'm personally reviewing a lot of papers every week, and I'm really tired. I only accept papers from journals whose editorial boards I sit in. So just to protect myself, because I get so many review requests, and only review those papers which I can really positively contribute to the development of. I don't review for ultimately rejecting a paper. I try to join the game with different this different perspective just to develop the papers. So if we warn the reviewers that they should not take papers if they are not really committed to it, I think that may be one way to get them to do it on time. But I don't know. I think we also need to talk to our departments that we are doing this additional work, and there should be some recognition in our workload.
I agree, absolutely. That should be part of recognition of workload, because it does take up a phenomenal amount of time. You're, contributing to development of other researchers and building their careers. So absolutely. So I'm just aware we've only got a few minutes left, and I just want to say thank you very much to all three of our speakers, to Ruby and Mustafa and Emilie, who gave their time today for free to a very, very important topic, which I know we've only really skimmed the surface on, but it was absolutely fantastic to hear different perspectives and from different, talking about sort of research funding and publishing as well. I just want to remind people that there is a second part to this seminar series, so it's not the only bit, which I think Fenella will speak to in a moment. We've got a slide about it. So we're going to actually hear from the funders themselves, which is quite exciting. And we've got special guests coming from Australia, which is why this one is slightly earlier in the day, which is the 22nd of May. Thank you very much for to put the link in there so you can book that if you want to. That is with my colleague, Stephanie Schneider, who is on the seminar at the moment. She's also one of the authors of the peer review report that we have got on our website. If you haven't read it, please do go ahead. It has got some recommendations in there for funders, so that'll be really interesting to find out how they respond to them. Fenella, is there anything else you'd like to say before we close off the seminar?
Yes, just that we have a call for participants right now for focus groups on research and innovation careers. So it's basically open to anybody and everybody from PhD student up to the provost. And there's a link there, and I'll put a link into the chat to our link tree, which will also have the seminars that are upcoming. We've also got a seminar that we are planning for June, which is going to be entirely in BSL, British Sign Language, and it will be interpreted for people who don't know BSL and are hearing. So that should be an interesting experience. So have a look out for that one being announced once we've settled on the date.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your time, everybody, and thank you for everyone who registered and expressed interest. And if you want to go and tweet about us or put us on Instagram and say something that you really enjoyed, or if you'd like to email us, please do. Once again, thank you very much to all the speakers. I hope you have a great rest of your day, particularly Emilie, who obviously dialed in from Guinea. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.